So Dow Constantine, the King County Executive, gave his State of the County address. And in it, he talked about the homeless crisis. How could you not? It's gigantic, so you can't really ignore it. But he said something I thought was downright ridiculous. Here it is.
One widely held belief is that behavioral health issues like untreated mental health or substance use disorders are root causes of the homelessness crisis that we see all around us. This is wrong. University of Washington researcher Greg Colburn has shown that the cause of the homelessness phenomenon is not individual challenges, but a housing market failure.
Okay, to which I thought that's ridiculous. He mentions a UW researcher. I don't need a researcher to tell me what I see with my own eyes. I don't need a researcher from UW to tell me what I've seen and what I've heard from people who are actually homeless. I don't need a UW researcher to tell me what we see service providers saying all the time. This is a drug crisis. This is a mental health crisis. And because people are either drug addicted or mentally ill, they wind up on the streets. And they could not keep a house or an apartment if they wanted to in a condition like that. So I thought that was just absurd. The internet thought it was pretty absurd too, because I could not believe how viral that one little clip of Dow Constantine went. I just posted his clip of him saying that, and holy shit, a bunch of times. And it got, 4.9 million, almost 5 million views on Dow Constantine's little clip just over the weekend. What was interesting, though, is it wasn't just shared by a bunch of people who agree with me or agree with my assessment. There were some people who thought that what he said was totally based and that he's completely right, and this is absolutely a lack of housing. And it's so simplistic the way that he put it, saying, we have X number of homes and X number of people, so if there are too few homes, then these people will just live on the street and inject drugs into their vein and walk around the sidewalks nude screaming at people. Yeah, because that makes an awful lot of sense. But this is, and what I would also say, can you play, Nicole, the clip from Dow just one more time?
One widely held belief is that behavioral health issues like untreated mental health or substance use disorders are root causes of the homelessness crisis that we see all around us. This is wrong. University of Washington researcher Greg Colburn has shown that the cause of the homelessness phenomenon is not individual challenges, but a housing market failure.
Okay, so let's say that he's right. Let's say he's right and it is housing market failure. This is a problem with housing affordability. Who should we blame then? Should we blame the King County Executive, who's been in office since 2009? Who's been in charge of the county's response to homelessness for 15 years? So if you're saying we have a housing problem and a housing shortage, what have you done over the past 15 years to make sure that's not the case? Obviously not enough, right? And if you're saying, well, you can't blame the King County Executive, this is a statewide problem. Okay, that's fine. Should we blame the governor, who has been in office for 12 years, who belongs to a party that has controlled the governor's mansion for 40 years, who said this during his State of the State address last year?
The fundamental underlying challenge is that we do not have enough housing in our state for our people.
Okay, then why haven't you made it so that we have more housing in our state for our people? Again, operating off of your mistaken belief. And I don't even know if they actually believe that or if they just know that they can get a lot more money from people if they put little measures on the ballot saying, hey, increase affordable housing, let us tax you. And that's just easier for them to do and to get money for their cronies. But again, if you have the King County Executive who's been in office for 15 years, the governor who's been in office for 12 years, who replaced a governor of his political party, who replaced a governor of her political party, who replaced a governor of his political party, going all the way back to the 1980s. Like, who do we blame here, right? That's a failure of your leadership and your brand of politics. But again, that's not the cause of homelessness. That's not the cause of the crisis that we are seeing on our streets right now. And it's shocking to me also, we're going to get into, I wanted to give, fair shot. Like Dow says, hey, it's a UW researcher and he has proven definitively that this is a failure of the housing system. So I was like, okay, I'll go dig into what this researcher is all about and I'll get to him in a moment. But, this simplistic idea of housing as a solution to homelessness, it's something that's also been pushed by the King County Regional Homelessness Authority that, has spent hundreds of millions of our dollars just for homelessness to increase by 23% year over year. We made fun of them kind of for this tweet on the show a while ago. They put out a graphic that just said, housing solves homelessness. Housing solves homelessness. And at the time I said, gosh, we're in trouble. If the entity that's job it is to figure out what's happening on our streets believes it's that simple, that housing solves homelessness. But why would they not say that? Because that's what the governor says. That's what the King County Executive says. That's what the party in power says. But I would also say, and go back to this very simplistic understanding of, if we just put everyone in homes, we wouldn't have the crisis that we have right now. But we know that putting a roof over someone's head is a Band-Aid, and it's a temporary Band-Aid, if you do not acknowledge and address the underlying reasons why they didn't have a roof over their head in the first place. You might recall We Heart Seattle and Andrea Suarez, they had sent us pictures of a low barrier housing apartment that they'd gone into, where a guy had a roof over his head, was in an affordable housing unit, but it was as if he was still homeless. He was defecating next to the toilet. He had graffitied all over the wall. He was still very much addicted to drugs. He was living in squalor and filth. So yeah, he had a house, he had an apartment, but his life was no better off than when he was living in a tent on the street. So when you say that housing solves homelessness, I guess that's true. If you're living in a house or an apartment, you're not houseless, you're not homeless, but nothing else in your life has improved. So is that what they want? Is that their measure of success for these people? Is it? That, hey, let's just get them off the street into shelter, and then we don't see them, and they're out of sight and out of mind, and they can die with a needle in their arm, in an apartment that they trash. That's fine. So if you look at it that way, housing solves homelessness. Okay, I guess that's technically true. But housing doesn't solve addiction. Housing doesn't solve mental health issues. And if you thrust someone into low barrier shelter, an affordable apartment, a tiny home, and they're still addicted to drugs or severely mentally ill, I promise you that they won't be able to keep a roof over their head for very long. And then what have you done? Nothing. Which makes a lot of sense because our government has been doing nothing for the better part of 15 years on this crisis. And that's why, since Dow Constantine declared that homelessness was a state of emergency in King County, in the 10 years since, homelessness has spiked more than 50%. Because they keep pushing this false narrative that, put a roof over their head. If you put them in a home, they're not homeless anymore. Well, they will be soon because you didn't fix anything else. And then you patted yourself on the back for it. And you called it empathy and you called it progressive. It's unreal to me that that's the party of progress, right? What kind of progress is that? So let me again dive into this. Greg Colburn, who's this UW researcher that Dow Constantine used to say that this is not a drug crisis or a homelessness crisis. It is a crisis that is the result of a housing failure. So Greg Colburn, UW researcher, but he also wrote a book about this, okay? He wrote a book about homelessness is a housing issue. And I watched this video this morning of him talking about the main point of his book. Here it is.
So the point of the book is to say, why do some cities have a huge homelessness problem and why do some not? Okay. And the punchline of the book is that housing market conditions, both the cost of housing and the availability of housing, is the best predictor of rates of homelessness on a per capita basis. Okay. And the book is focused at the city level or the region level, not at the individual level. Right. And so a lot of homelessness research is focused on the individual and says if Greg were mentally ill or Greg took drugs or Greg was in poverty, Greg's more likely to be homeless. And that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And so these individual factors are certainly important. And we certainly see it when we're walking around and we see people who are addicted or mentally ill. But the research in the book demonstrates that it's not that we have more people with those vulnerabilities. We don't have more people with mental illness. We don't have more people who are addicted. We don't have more people who are living in poverty. In fact, we have less than a lot of other regions, right? But the consequences of those vulnerabilities in Seattle are much worse than they are in Chicago, Cleveland, or Detroit, where housing costs are much, much lower and vacancy rates are much, much higher, rental vacancy rates. And so the point is that if we focus on these individual vulnerabilities and say, we've got a drug problem in Seattle, then I don't believe we are ever going to solve this problem, because it's not a drug problem. Drugs certainly make it more likely that you'll experience homelessness, and that's more likely in Seattle than Chicago, but we can't treat our way out of this, right? Because ultimately we still have a huge deficit of housing.
We can't treat our way out of this. I think I understand now. I think I understand now the argument that they're making. And it is as simplistic as I thought when I first heard Dow Constantine say that. So what he's saying, we can't treat our way out of this because then we still have a housing shortage. So, if we treat the drug addict on the streets, we might not have a house or an apartment to put them in. So you just don't do it? So you just don't treat them? So it would be worse or the same, in your opinion, to just not treat them, okay, and put them in a housing unit? Like, that's a win for you? As opposed to, if we can't put them in a house, why treat their drug addiction? Like, let them at least keep using while they're living in a tent. So that's the mindset. When I hear that, when I hear Dow, when I hear Jay, when they see homelessness, when they see that word, they literally say, okay, if you have a home, you're not homeless anymore. So that's what they're saying. Their solution to fixing this issue is to put people, no matter what state they're in, no matter their ability to keep a roof over their head, to be able to hold down a job to pay bills, their idea of fixing the homeless problem is to make sure that no one is homeless. Now, they can be in a house, and they point to, some places in impoverished areas of the South where you have some pretty high addiction rates and have for a long time. But people still have, a trailer park or something that they live in. And they see that as a solution, as better somehow. Where I look at this and I say, I don't care if someone has a house that they're living in, an apartment, an affordable housing unit, whatever it is. If they still are deeply drug addicted or mentally ill, we have not bettered their circumstances at all. And to suggest that we are bettering their circumstances simply by putting a roof over their head is insane. And I point back to, again, that guy in the apartment that Andrea Suarez took pictures of. Living in filth, feces on the floor, killing himself with drugs. Is it better because he does it inside four walls? I don't think so. And what this UW researcher is also failing to, I think, factor in to his research to sell his book are the policies and how allowable it is in a lot of West Coast cities to just let people live in filth and squalor right before our eyes and shoot up drugs right before our eyes and not put them in jail for it. There's an incentive there when you have a carrot and a stick and you have police going out and saying, you're not going to live here on the streets. You're not going to do this, or you're going to go to jail. There's an incentive there that makes them maybe wake up and say, okay, I've got to seek out treatment. I've got to do something better. I mean, in those areas of the South where people are drug addicted or whatever it is, and they're housed, they probably would be homeless if law enforcement in the South and politicians in the South let them do what we did here. And just, no, that's fine. Like, no big deal. Hey, you do you, steal, rob, whatever you need to do to support your drug habit, whatever it is, or live on the street. Like, we're fine with that. We're not going to criminalize that. Yeah, those people in the South probably wouldn't have, found a trailer to live in or something like that. So it's this fundamental disagreement, I think, with what the homeless crisis means and what it is and what it's going to take to actually better their lives. Because let's look at it like that. That's how we should all look at it, right? How do we better this person's life? We have a person living in the streets in a tent. How do we make sure for the long term their life is better? Because it's not a better life to be living in an apartment and still be addicted to deadly drugs, suffering with mental illness. Now, if Dow thinks it is, then he needs to say that. If Jay Inslee thinks it is, then he needs to say that. Because that's very clearly not empathy. It's not solving any problems. And you're just going to have those people continue to cycle in and out of the system. It's also this matter for me. And there was a clip, speaking of the guy who was in this affordable housing unit, just living about as bad of a life as he had anywhere else. You know, Andrea had also talked, we played this clip on the show a couple months ago. You know, I'm in this position where I'm like, who do I believe? Who do you believe, you know? Do I believe Dow Constantine, like the career politician, when he tells me what the homelessness crisis is? Do I believe Jay Inslee, the career politician, when he says from his mountaintop what the homelessness crisis is, from his multi-million-dollar house on Bainbridge Island, what the homelessness crisis is? Or do I believe homeless people who, if you've ever spoken to any in Seattle, will tell you that they're either drug addicted or mentally ill? There's this clip of Andrea Suarez asking a couple that came into the We Heart Seattle offices, hey, what's stopping you from getting a roof over your head?
Hey, you guys just walked into my office. I haven't seen you in a minute. It's been a few months, but I've known you since Denny Park when you guys were living in a tent in the park. Emily and Kevin. Emily and Kevin. And we're talking today about what is the number one barrier that's keeping you guys from affording an apartment? Is it high rent? What is the immediate barrier that's keeping you from taking the next step towards housing?
Drugs. Drugs. That's what it is. So I think, okay, do I trust the UW researcher? Who's talking about, I've traveled all around the world and all this? Good for you, man. Like, good for you. Have you ever been homeless? So do I trust Dow? Do I trust Jay Inslee? Do I trust the UW researcher? Or do I trust people who are actually homeless in saying what their issue is and what's preventing them from moving forward with their life? On Sundays with Subscribers, we spoke to a man named Tim Emerson. Tim works for We Heart Seattle, but he's also a former drug addict. And I played for him this clip of Dow Constantine, and he reacted to it basically by saying that's not what we're seeing when we interact with these people out on the streets.
Well, let's just take a look at the housing that we're going into, these low barrier housing places that we have available. You go in, it's full of needles, and they're passing out the needles and the foils, and then they're getting kicked out constantly. It's kind of a rodeo inside. So it's a constant revolving door of the same people over and over because of that addiction and the untreated mental illness. They're going in and out of these doors. That they're there, they're just not staying in there.
Sorry. I just want to be clear. You're talking about people who've gotten housing, a roof over their head, but they are still addicted to drugs.
Yes. Yep. And we're not dealing with that issue at all. And then they're just slowly filtering back out the doors or dying behind the door. We're a boots on the ground agency here. I go out and I talk to these people. I know what their needs are. And I can tell you 100% of these people out there have been homeless, and they have been housed, and they have been homeless, and they have been housed, and they all have addiction issues. 95% of who I'm talking to are openly admitting that they have addiction issues and they need help with it, and they just don't know how.
Yeah, they don't have a government that's capable of helping them with it. That's Tim Emerson. You can watch our full interview from Sundays with Subscribers at undividedpod.com, undividedpod.com. I am much more apt to believe someone like Tim, who's out there doing this every single day and who understands that homelessness is not driven simply by a lack of available housing. No person in their right mind, if they cannot afford a house or an apartment, simply says, okay, well, I'm going to go live on the street then, and I'm going to inject drugs, and the drugs are going to turn into a mental health crisis, and then I'm going to be beyond saving. Now, do I think that there is the occasional case of someone who falls out of their housing, has no safety net with family or anything like that, and winds up homeless? Yes, I do. But I think that is a fraction of a single percentage of the crisis that we're seeing. And again, if it is a housing crisis, if you disagree with me on that point, if you do believe it's a housing crisis, an affordability crisis, then answer me this: who's to blame? Who's to blame for it then? Would it not be the party in power and the politicians that have been in power for 3 terms or 4 terms while this crisis has worsened? So even if you agree with Dow, you would then have to turn around and blame Dow for the situation and how bad it's become. I would also note, when it comes to data on this issue is entirely faulty because the way that they collect data is biased. It's unhinged, in fact. They do these point in time counts. They do surveys of people who are out living on the streets. And we've talked about this on the show previously, but I thought it was worth revisiting. The King County Regional Homeless Authority, one of these times that they went out and tried to collect information on, how old were you when you first started living on the streets, and, where are you originally from, and all of this. One of the survey questions was, what events or condition contributed to your experience of homelessness? And there's this long list of things that these homeless individuals could choose from. Lost job, eviction, foreclosure, incarceration, couldn't afford rent, family domestic violence, resettlement transition, death of a parent. Nowhere in there. There isn't even an option. And there's like 20, 25 options here. There isn't even an option for substance abuse. So it's like they either don't care to know the truth, don't want to know the truth. There isn't even an option. The single most obvious cause of homelessness, substance abuse. And there isn't even an option on here for them to select that. You know how many totally normal middle-class families and even upper middle-class families and parents I've spoken to whose child had everything they could ever hope for, a roof over their head, a family that loved them and was willing to care for them, that spiraled into addiction, usually through opioids or painkillers, wound up doing heroin, and then wound up doing fentanyl and wound up on the streets. So many. We've had people on on the show who had stable housing and would have continued to have stable housing if not for their drug addiction. So again, I'm going to bring it full circle by saying we cannot solve a problem that we refuse to properly identify. And the party that created these crises is not the party that is going to fix them.